The strange thing about fate is that sometimes it doesn't knock before changing your life. The burst of camera flashes lit the backstage corridor in sharp white pulses as Clara Whitmore pressed trembling fingers against the torn silver fabric of a designer gown worth more money than she had seen in an entire year. Around her, stylists rushed past, carrying makeup kits and garment bags while assistants barked timing updates into headsets. The air smelled like hairspray, perfume, overheated lighting equipment, and stress. Somewhere beyond the curtains, hundreds of wealthy guests filled the ballroom of the Crown Meridian Hotel in downtown Sydney, sipping champagne beneath crystal chandeliers, while photographers shouted the names of models stepping onto the charity runway. Clara barely heard any of it anymore. Her pulse drowned everything out. "You had one job," Vanessa hissed beside her, snatching the damaged gown from Clara's hands with enough force to nearly pull her forward. "One job, Clara. Do you have any idea what this dress costs?" Clara swallowed hard and lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry. The zipper caught when I don't need excuses." Vanessa's voice sliced through the noise backstage like broken glass. "Do you know how embarrassing this is? Mr. Calloway's already here. Investors are already seated. If this show falls apart because of you, I swear you'll never work another fashion event in Sydney again." Clara nodded quietly, even though humiliation burned hot behind her ribs. She had heard versions of that threat before. At 24 years old, she was already exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with sleep. She worked fashion events 3 nights a week, waitressed at a diner near Circular Quay on weekends, and spent every spare dollar helping pay for her younger sister Ivy's medical treatments. Some mornings she woke up so tired she forgot where she was for a few seconds. But she kept going because stopping wasn't an option, not when someone else depended on her. Vanessa shoved another garment toward her chest. "Take this to the VIP suite upstairs. The replacement model arrives in 10 minutes. And for once in your life, don't ruin it." Clara grabbed the dress carefully and hurried toward the private elevators before the woman could say anything else. Her flats tapped softly against the marble floor while music from the ballroom pulsed faintly through the walls. The hotel glittered with impossible wealth tonight. Gold light reflected off polished glass surfaces. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed beside enormous floral displays. Women with diamonds around their throats posed for photographs beneath banners advertising the hospital charity fundraiser Ethan Calloway himself had financed. Clara had seen his face before, of course. Everyone in Australia had. Billionaire CEO, founder of Callaway Luxe. The man business magazines called cold, brilliant, and untouchable. Rumors followed him everywhere. He bought companies the way ordinary people bought coffee. He dated actresses for a few months at a time and disappeared before anyone learned anything real about him. People said he never smiled unless cameras demanded it. Clara stepped into the empty elevator and exhaled shakily as the doors closed. For a moment, silence wrapped around her. She leaned back against the mirrored wall and stared at her reflection beneath the harsh lights overhead. Her blonde hair had started slipping loose from its neat clip hours ago. Dark circles shadowed beneath her blue eyes despite the makeup she had rushed on in the staff restroom. There was a tiny burn mark near her wrist from the diner coffee machine she worked 2 nights ago. Nobody backstage tonight noticed details like that. They only noticed perfection or failure. The elevator doors slid open onto the private hotel level reserved for celebrity guests and executive sponsors. Thick carpet softened her footsteps immediately. The hallway smelled faintly of cedarwood and expensive cologne. Clara checked the suite number scribbled on the garment tag and hurried toward the final door at the end of the corridor. Suite 1904. She knocked lightly, but heard nothing inside. Probably empty already. She carefully pushed the door open. Warm amber light spilled across the room. A massive suite stretched before her with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Sydney Harbor glowing against the night sky. Clara stepped inside quietly and carried the gown toward the dressing area near the bedroom, unaware that 1 floor below, Ethan Calloway had just walked away from a conversation worth nearly $90 million because suddenly he couldn't breathe properly inside the ballroom anymore. At 38, Ethan had mastered the art of looking calm while feeling absolutely nothing. He shook hands, signed contracts, built empires, smiled when necessary. But lately, every room felt too loud, and every conversation sounded rehearsed. Tonight was no different. Wealthy donors surrounded him downstairs with polished laughter and practiced admiration, while cameras flashed against his tired eyes. 5 minutes until your speech, Mr. Calloway, his assistant reminded him quietly. Ethan loosened his tie slightly. I'll be back. He ignored the concern in the man's face and headed toward the private elevators, needing 1 minute alone before another hour of pretending. His suite upstairs waited untouched, silent, predictable, exactly how he preferred things. But fate rarely asks permission before changing direction. Ethan reached Suite 1904 and pushed the door open while checking a message on his phone. Cancel New York tomorrow morning, he muttered distractedly before looking up. Then he stopped moving entirely. Clara Whitmore stood frozen beside the dressing mirror with one hand gripping the silver fabric against her chest. Her staff blazer, stained with foundation powder from the chaos downstairs, lay folded over a chair while she stood in her simple work blouse, carefully pinning the replacement gown back onto its padded hanger beneath the hotel lighting. Shock flooded her face instantly the moment she saw him in the doorway. Ethan turned away immediately. I'm sorry. His voice came lower than expected, rougher somehow. I thought the suite was empty. Clara's heartbeat slammed painfully against her ribs as she snatched the blazer from the nearby chair and pulled it over her shoulders, more startled than exposed, but embarrassed all the same. It's okay, she whispered automatically, even though embarrassment scorched her cheeks. Ethan should have left. Immediately. Any normal person would have. But for one strange suspended second, neither of them moved. Because it wasn't desire that made Ethan freeze in the doorway. It was the look in her eyes. Not vanity. Not flirtation. Fear. The kind carried by people used to apologizing for existing too loudly in rooms built for richer souls. And somehow, beneath the golden hotel lights spilling softly across her trembling hands, Ethan felt something shift painfully inside his chest for the first time in years. The silence inside the suite lasted barely 3 seconds, but somehow it felt longer than the entire evening downstairs. Clara kept her eyes lowered as she slipped her blazer over her shoulders with hurried fingers, painfully aware that Ethan Calloway was still standing near the doorway. Most powerful men she had encountered in the fashion industry looked at women as if they were decorations placed inside expensive rooms. But Ethan had turned away the moment he realized what happened. That should not have mattered as much as it did. Yet somehow it did. I should go, Clara murmured softly, clutching the replacement gown against herself before moving toward the door. Ethan stepped aside immediately to let her pass. You do not have to apologize, he said quietly. Clara paused for half a second because she had not realized she had whispered the words, I am sorry, under her breath again. It was a habit now. Apologizing when people bumped into her. Apologizing when elevators closed too quickly. Apologizing for taking up space. She nodded once without looking directly at him and hurried into the hallway before the heat rising in her cheeks became unbearable. The corridor outside felt colder somehow. Clara exhaled shakily and pressed the elevator button with trembling hands while her pulse refused to slow down. She could still hear his voice in her head. Calm. Low. Gentle in a way she had not expected from someone the media described as ruthless. The elevator door slid open and she stepped inside quickly, hoping nobody noticed how flustered she looked. Downstairs, the backstage area had become complete chaos. Music thundered from the ballroom while models lined up near. The runway entrance beneath blinding white lights. Someone shouted about missing jewelry. Another assistant sprinted past carrying emergency sewing kits. Clara barely had time to place the replacement gown onto the correct rack before Vanessa stormed toward her again. Where the hell were you? Vanessa snapped. The donor presentation starts in 7 minutes. Clara swallowed. I took the gown upstairs like you asked. Vanessa's sharp eyes narrowed immediately. To the executive level? Clara nodded cautiously. Interesting. Something ugly flickered across the older woman's face then. The kind of expression Clara had learned to recognize instantly in industries built on status and gossip. You were gone a long time. Clara blinked in confusion. The lift was slow. Vanessa crossed her arms. Do not play innocent with me, Clara. Girls have embarrassed themselves trying to get close to Ethan Calloway before. Trust me, it never ends well. The accusation hit like icy water. Clara stared at her. That is not what happened. Good, Vanessa replied coldly. Because women like you should remember the difference between fantasy and reality. Clara lowered her gaze again, even though shame twisted painfully in her stomach. Not because she believed the accusation, but because she was tired of people deciding who she was before hearing her speak. Vanessa turned sharply and disappeared toward the runway entrance, already yelling at someone else. Clara stood frozen for a moment before quietly stepping behind a stack of garment cases where nobody could see her face. She inhaled slowly. One breath, then another. Keep moving. That was the rule. No matter how tired. No matter how humiliating the day became. Keep moving. Her phone buzzed softly inside her blazer pocket. Clara pulled it out immediately, her expression softening the moment she saw Ivy's name across the screen. She answered at once. Hey, Ivy. You sound tired, her younger sister said gently. In the background, Clara could hear the faint sound of hospital television advertisements and distant trolley wheels rolling across polished floors. Long night. Clara leaned against the wall and closed her eyes briefly. Fashion people are dramatic. Nothing new. Ivy laughed softly before coughing into the phone. The sound tightened something painful inside Clara's chest immediately. Did the specialist come by? Clara asked carefully. This afternoon, Ivy replied. He changed some of my medication again. Clara stared down at the scuffed toes of her flats. Is it helping? There was a tiny pause, too small for most people to notice. But Clara noticed everything when it came to her sister. It will, Ivy answered finally. Do not worry so much. Clara smiled sadly despite herself. Ivy always did that. Pretended things were easier than they were so Clara would not drown beneath responsibility completely. I will come by after work, Clara promised quietly. You should sleep instead, Ivy said. You worked the diner until 2 in the morning yesterday. I am fine. Clara, her sister's voice softened. You cannot save everyone if you fall apart first. Before Clara could answer, another voice suddenly echoed through backstage speakers announcing Ethan Calloway's arrival onto the ballroom stage for the opening charity address. Applause thundered faintly through the walls. Clara glanced toward the curtains without meaning to. I have to go, she whispered. I will bring your favorite caramel slices later. Ivy laughed again. Deal. The call ended. Clara slipped her phone away slowly and pushed herself upright before rejoining the backstage rush. On stage, Ethan adjusted the microphone while hundreds of guests turned toward him beneath gold chandelier light. Cameras flashed continuously across the ballroom. He looked exactly how magazines always portrayed him. Composed, impossibly polished, untouchable. Yet tonight something felt wrong, or perhaps unfamiliar. Ethan rarely noticed individuals during charity galas anymore. Faces blurred together after years of networking events and endless corporate performances. But while speaking about hospital funding initiatives and community outreach programs, his attention drifted unexpectedly toward the backstage entrance near the curtains. And there she was. Clara stood half-hidden behind equipment cases while helping another assistant repair a torn hemline moments before a model stepped onto the runway. Her blonde hair had loosened further now, soft strands falling around her face beneath the harsh backstage lighting. She moved quickly despite obvious exhaustion, quietly fixing problems nobody else wanted to handle. No complaints, no attempts to be noticed, just steady determination beneath pressure that would have broken many people hours ago. Ethan lost his place mid-sentence for the first time in years. The audience never noticed, but he did. His assistant standing near the front table noticed too. Ethan recovered instantly and continued speaking, yet his eyes drifted toward the backstage curtains again before he could stop himself. Strange. He had spent most of his adult life surrounded by beautiful women. Models. Socialites. Celebrities. Beauty had become ordinary long ago. Predictable. But Clara Whitmore did not look polished in the way high society preferred. She looked tired. Human. Real. And somehow that unsettled him far more than perfection ever could. Backstage, Clara bent down to retrieve a dropped makeup brush when suddenly the overhead corridor lights flickered once. Then twice. A murmur spread across the room immediately. Please tell me the power is not failing, one stylist groaned. Clara glanced upward instinctively, just as every light backstage shut off completely. The darkness backstage swallowed the room so suddenly that several people gasped out loud. Someone dropped a metal makeup case nearby, and the sharp crash echoed through the corridor while confused voices rose all around them. The music from the ballroom continued for 2 awkward seconds before cutting out completely, leaving only muffled conversation and the distant hum of emergency generators somewhere deep inside the hotel. Clara froze instinctively, her heartbeat quickening as shadows swallowed the crowded backstage area. "Do not panic," one event coordinator shouted immediately. "The backup system will kick in." But the tension spreading through the room felt immediate and contagious. Models pulled out phone torches. Stylists cursed under their breath. Assistants rushed toward electrical panels while expensive gowns brushed across the floor in the confusion. Clara bent down automatically to gather scattered makeup brushes that had rolled beneath a garment rack moments before the lights failed. Even in chaos, she noticed details. A model near the curtain looked close to tears because her heel strap had snapped. Another assistant was struggling to carry 3 steaming garment steamers alone. Nobody ever stopped to help the invisible workers first. Clara moved toward the younger assistant without hesitation. "I have got one," she said softly, lifting one of the heavy steamers despite the ache already burning through her shoulders from the long shift. "Thanks," the girl breathed gratefully. Emergency lighting flickered faintly overhead a moment later, bathing the backstage corridor in dim amber shadows instead of full brightness. Everything suddenly looked softer, stranger, less glamorous. Clara carried the steamer toward the changing area carefully, weaving through nervous staff members while trying not to trip over cables running across the floor. Somewhere near the runway entrance, Vanessa was already shouting at technicians about donor expectations and timing delays. Clara barely listened anymore. Her feet hurt, her head hurt, and she still needed to visit Ivy at St. Vincent's Hospital after this ended. Across the ballroom, guests murmured uneasily beneath the fading chandelier lights, while hotel staff rushed discreetly between tables. Ethan stepped away from the stage the moment his speech was interrupted and loosened his tie slightly again. "What happened?" he asked calmly. His assistant checked messages on a tablet. "Temporary power issue on the west side of the building. The hotel says it should stabilize shortly." Ethan nodded once, though his attention drifted automatically toward the backstage corridor beyond the curtains. Strange. He should have been annoyed. Investors from Melbourne and Singapore sat waiting inside this room. Millions of dollars depended on maintaining flawless appearances tonight. Yet somehow his mind kept returning to one exhausted blonde girl carrying too much responsibility behind tired eyes. "Mr. Calloway?" his assistant asked. Carefully, Ethan blinked. "What?" "The board members are waiting in the private lounge." 5 minutes. Before the assistant could respond, Ethan had already stepped away from the ballroom tables and headed quietly toward the backstage corridor instead. The deeper he walked into the backstage area, the more artificial the glamour became. Up close, the fashion world looked less like elegance and more like survival hidden beneath expensive fabric. Models rubbed blistered feet between runway walks. Makeup artists wiped sweat from their necks beneath harsh heat lamps. Staff members sprinted carrying bottled water, sewing kits, extension cords, and coffee cups. Nobody noticed Ethan immediately in the dim emergency lighting. For the first time all night, he could observe people without cameras changing their behavior around him. Then he saw her again. Clara stood near a folding table under soft amber emergency lights, kneeling beside a young model whose trembling hands struggled to fix a broken shoe clasp. "Hold still," Clara whispered gently while using a tiny safety pin from her blazer pocket to secure the strap temporarily. "There. It should survive one walk." "You just saved my life," the nervous model laughed shakily. Clara smiled faintly. No runway emergency has ever killed anyone. Ethan found himself watching the way she spoke to people. Quietly, kindly, as though every exhausted person around her still mattered. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Most people changed entirely when powerful men entered rooms. They performed, impressed, calculated. But Clara Whitmore behaved the same way whether anyone important noticed her or not. That was rare, very rare. Before Ethan could step forward, another voice cut sharply through the dim corridor. "Clara." Vanessa approached with crossed arms and visible irritation. "What exactly are you doing?" Clara stood immediately. "Helping backstage." "No," Vanessa snapped. "You are wasting time socializing while everyone else works." Clara blinked in surprise. The model needed help with her shoe, and now she has it. "Congratulations." Several nearby assistants fell silent instantly. Nobody liked Vanessa, but nobody challenged her either. Clara lowered her eyes again. Ethan recognized that reaction immediately now. The instinctive shrinking. The apology before punishment even arrived. I am sorry. Of course you are. Vanessa glanced briefly toward Ethan, then suddenly straightened her posture, clearly noticing him for the first time. Her entire expression transformed within seconds into polished professionalism. Mr. Calloway, she said quickly with a bright smile. We are handling the technical delay. Ethan's gaze never left Clara. I can see that. Vanessa laughed lightly. Some staff handle pressure better than others. Clara gripped the edge of the folding table quietly. Ethan noticed the small movement instantly. Embarrassment again. Shame that did not belong to her. Something cold settled unpleasantly inside his chest. What is your name? Ethan asked suddenly. Vanessa answered before Clara could speak. Vanessa Brooks. Lead styling coordinator for tonight's event. I was asking her. Silence dropped between them immediately. Clara looked startled as Ethan finally turned toward her directly beneath the dim emergency lights. Up close, exhaustion softened every delicate feature in her face. Yet somehow she still carried herself with quiet dignity despite standing in worn flats while surrounded by luxury. Clara Whitmore, she answered softly. Ethan nodded once. You handled the situation calmly. Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly. Clara is new. Is she? Ethan replied mildly. Because she seems to be the only person here fixing problems instead of shouting about them. The corridor fell completely silent. Clara's eyes widened slightly in shock while nearby assistants avoided looking directly at anyone. Vanessa's expression stiffened instantly. Ethan rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. Calm disappointment from men like him carried more weight than yelling ever could. Well, Vanessa said carefully, everyone contributes differently. Ethan looked toward Clara again. Apparently. Then before anyone could respond further, the main overhead lights suddenly flickered back to life across the backstage corridor. Bright white illumination flooded the room once more. Conversations resumed instantly. Music from the ballroom returned through hidden speakers. The spell of the darkened hallway disappeared almost immediately. But Clara still stood frozen beside the folding table, staring at Ethan as if she could not quite understand what had just happened. Because nobody important had defended her before. Not once. Ethan held her gaze for one strange suspended second longer than necessary before his assistant appeared behind him again. Mr. Calloway, the board members are waiting. Ethan nodded without looking away from Clara immediately. Then finally he turned and walked back toward the ballroom. But halfway down the corridor, he slowed unexpectedly. Find out who she is, he said quietly to his assistant. The man looked confused. The assistant. Ethan adjusted his cuff absent-mindedly. Yes. Professionally, Ethan stared ahead toward the glowing ballroom lights. Personally, he answered softly, surprising even himself. Clara could still feel the weight of Ethan Calloway's eyes on her long after he disappeared back toward the ballroom. The backstage corridor had returned to normal within minutes after the power came back on, but something inside her remained unsettled. Staff members resumed rushing between garment racks and makeup stations, while music swelled once more from the runway speakers. Yet Clara's heartbeat refused to steady properly. She bent down to organize scattered fabric clips near one of the folding tables, forcing herself to focus on simple tasks instead of replaying the conversation in her mind. He defended me. The thought felt strange. Unreal. Powerful men usually looked through women like her as though they were part of the furniture. Temporary. Replaceable. Invisible. Yet Ethan had noticed her. Worse somehow, he had been kind about it. And kindness from someone like him felt dangerous in ways cruelty never did. You seem distracted. Clara glanced up quickly as Mia, another backstage assistant, handed her a bottled water. Mia was only 19 and constantly nervous during fashion events. But tonight she wore a curious smile. I am fine, Clara answered softly. Mia lowered her voice. Immediately. Vanessa is furious. Clara almost laughed from exhaustion. Vanessa is always furious. No, Mia whispered, eyes widening slightly. I mean really furious. She told two coordinators that you embarrassed her in front of Mr. Calloway. Clara looked away quietly. I did not ask him to say anything. I know. Mia hesitated. But people noticed. That sentence settled heavily in Clara's stomach. People noticed. In industries built on gossip and assumptions, attention could become dangerous very quickly. especially for girls without money, status, or protection. Clara twisted the cap off the water bottle slowly. Nothing happened. Mia studied her face carefully for a moment before nodding. Still, she murmured, I have never seen him look at someone like that before. Before Clara could respond, another coordinator shouted for assistance near the VIP guest lounge upstairs. Mia hurried away immediately, while Clara remained frozen beside the folding table for one strange second longer. She should not care what Ethan Calloway thought of her. Their worlds were too different to touch for more than a passing moment. Men like him belonged in glass towers overlooking the harbor. Women like Clara rode overcrowded buses home after midnight, carrying leftover pastries and paper bags because hospital cafeteria food cost too much. The distance between those lives could not be crossed with one accidental encounter in a hotel suite. Yet somehow she still remembered the way his voice softened when he apologized. Clara forced herself back to work before her thoughts drifted further. 2 hours later, the charity gala finally began winding down. Wealthy guests filtered toward waiting luxury cars beneath the glowing entrance canopy, while exhausted event staff started dismantling runway equipment backstage. Clara rubbed her aching shoulder carefully as she carried empty garment racks toward storage. Her entire body felt heavy now. She had been awake since 5:30 that morning after finishing a late diner shift the night before. Whitmore. Vanessa's sharp voice sliced through the hallway again. Clara turned immediately. Vanessa approached holding a clipboard against her chest, her expression unreadable beneath perfectly applied makeup. The floral installation upstairs needs clearing before midnight. Since everyone else already has assignments, you can handle it. Clara blinked tiredly. Alone. Vanessa gave a thin smile. You wanted to impress management tonight, did you not? Clara lowered her gaze. I never said that. Good. Then perhaps you can prove you actually deserve to work here. Without waiting for a response, Vanessa turned and walked away in sharp heels echoing against the marble floor. Clara stared after her quietly for a moment before exhaling slowly. Fine. One more task. Then hospital. Then home. She grabbed the service trolley and headed toward the executive level where private donor suites overlooked Sydney Harbor through towering glass windows. The hotel had become much quieter now. Most guests were gone, leaving only soft piano music drifting through hidden speakers and the distant sounds of cleaners vacuuming carpets somewhere below. Clara stepped into the private elevator alone and leaned briefly against the mirrored wall as fatigue pressed heavily behind her eyes. When the doors opened upstairs, silence greeted her immediately. Thick carpets softened every footstep along the corridor lined with luxury suites and gold wall sconces. Clara moved slowly toward the floral installation near the executive lounge, carrying cleaning bags and folded linens. White roses covered nearly every surface around the lounge entrance, their sweet scent lingering heavily in the still air. She began dismantling arrangements carefully, one stem at a time, placing flowers into boxes for donation pickup in the morning. Nearly 20 minutes passed in silence before she heard footsteps approaching softly down the corridor behind her. Clara glanced up instinctively. Ethan Calloway stood near the corner hallway wearing his dark suit jacket draped loosely over one shoulder now, his tie slightly undone for the first time all evening. Without the ballroom lights and cameras surrounding him, he somehow looked less intimidating. More tired. Human, almost. Clara straightened immediately. Mr. Calloway. Ethan's gaze moved briefly across the half-packed flower arrangements before returning to her face. You are still here. Cleaning crew work never ends. The corner of his mouth almost lifted slightly at that. Almost. They have an entire hotel staff for this. Clara shrugged faintly. Tonight they have me instead. Silence settled softly between them. Not awkward exactly. Just unfamiliar. Ethan stepped closer slowly, noticing the way Clara tried discreetly to stretch one sore wrist while lifting another heavy floral box. How many hours have you worked today? He asked suddenly. Clara looked surprised by the question. I do not know exactly. That many. She gave a tired little smile before she could stop herself. I stopped counting after 14. Ethan stared at her quietly for a moment. 14 hours. Most executives he knew complained when meetings lasted past lunch. Clara bent to lift another arrangement from the floor when suddenly the heel of her worn black flat caught slightly against the thick carpet edge. The heavy floral box tilted sharply sideways. Ethan moved instinctively before she could steady it alone, catching the weight with one hand while the other reached briefly toward her elbow to keep her balanced. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds. Barely anything at all. Yet Clara froze instantly beneath the warmth of his hand against her sleeve. Ethan released her immediately once the box steadied between them again. "Careful," he said quietly. Clara nodded too quickly. "Sorry." There was that word again. "Sorry." Ethan noticed the exhaustion hiding behind her polite expression. The instinctive fear of inconveniencing people. He had seen employees fear powerful men before. But Clara's apologies felt older somehow, worn into her. Ethan glanced toward the service trolley beside her and noticed a small hospital visitor sticker partially tucked beneath her folded blazer pocket. St. Vincent's Cardiac Unit. His eyes shifted back toward her face slowly. "Someone you care about is sick," he said gently. Clara's expression changed immediately. Not dramatic, just guarded, like a door quietly closing. "My sister." Ethan nodded once. "Is she going to be okay?" Clara looked down at the white roses in the box between them. "I hope so." Her voice came softer than before, honest in a way that lingered painfully in the quiet hallway. And for reasons Ethan could not fully explain yet, hearing those 3 words affected him far more than it should have. The harbor lights shimmered beyond the towering glass windows, scattering silver reflections across the quiet executive corridor, while Clara lowered her eyes toward the box of white roses between them. "I hope so." The words stayed suspended softly in the silence after she spoke them. Ethan did not answer immediately. He was not a man known for emotional conversations. Entire business magazines had been written about his ability to remain detached under pressure. Investors admired it. Competitors feared it. Former girlfriends quietly resented it. Yet standing beside Clara Whitmore in the middle of a half-empty hotel corridor at nearly midnight, Ethan suddenly found himself wanting to ask questions he normally avoided. Dangerous questions. Human ones. Clara carefully adjusted the flowers inside the box to avoid meeting his eyes again. She could still feel the warmth of his hand lingering faintly against her sleeve where he steadied her moments earlier. It had been such a small gesture, barely noticeable. But after years of surviving mostly on her own, gentleness always startled her more than cruelty did. Cruelty was predictable. Gentleness made people hopeful. And hope could become painful very quickly. Ethan finally spoke. "How old is your sister?" 19. Clara's voice softened immediately at the mention of Ivy. She was diagnosed when she was 13. Ethan nodded slowly. "Heart condition?" Clara looked briefly surprised he recognized the hospital department from the visitor sticker. "Congenital valve complications," she explained quietly. "She has surgeries every few years." Ethan glanced toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Sydney Harbor. Somewhere below, luxury cars slid through midnight traffic while ferries crossed dark water beneath the opera house lights. His world had always been filled with expensive solutions. Private doctors, immediate treatment, emergency, flights if necessary. Yet Clara spoke about serious illness with the calm exhaustion of someone who had spent years calculating medication costs before buying groceries. "And you are paying for this alone?" Ethan asked carefully. Clara gave the faintest shrug. "Mostly. What about your parents?" Silence settled again, softer this time. Clara folded the edge of the empty flower wrapping paper carefully between her fingers before answering. "My father left when I was little." Her expression remained calm, but Ethan noticed how tightly she pressed the paper between her hands. "Mum passed away 3 years ago." "I am sorry." Clara nodded politely. "Cancer." One simple word. No self-pity attached to it. No dramatic performance. Just quiet truth spoken by someone too tired to make tragedy sound poetic anymore. Ethan looked at her differently then. Not because he pitied her. He hated pity. But because Clara carried hardship without bitterness hardening her completely. That was rare. Most people became cruel after enough disappointment. She somehow had not. A soft vibration interrupted the silence suddenly. Clara's phone. Her expression changed immediately the moment she saw the screen light up. Fear moved across her face so quickly Ethan almost missed it. "I need to take this." She stepped slightly aside before answering. "Ivy." Ethan watched the color slowly drain from Clara's features while she listened. "What happened?" she whispered urgently. A pause. Then another. "Did they call the specialist?" Clara pressed one hand against her forehead. "I am coming now." The call ended. For one brief second, Clara simply stood there staring at nothing, breathing too quickly beneath the soft corridor lights. Ethan stepped closer instinctively. What happened? Clara blinked hard as though trying to pull herself together fast enough to function properly. My sister had trouble breathing after her medication adjustment. She grabbed the handle of the service trolley immediately. I need to go. Ethan noticed the tremor in her fingers as she tried lifting another floral box back onto the trolley. She was exhausted, frightened, running entirely on determination now. Without another word, Ethan reached down and lifted the remaining boxes himself before placing them neatly onto the trolley. Clara stared at him in surprise. You do not have to. Neither do you. Their eyes met again briefly beneath the warm corridor lights. Ethan noticed the way Clara looked at him now. Not dazzled, not flirtatious, simply confused by kindness she did not expect. Thank you, she whispered softly. The words came so honestly that something uncomfortable tightened inside Ethan's chest again. Most gratitude directed toward him came wrapped in ambition. People thanked him because they wanted access, influence, opportunity. Clara thanked him like someone who genuinely meant it. They walked together toward the private lifts in quiet silence while hotel cleaners moved discreetly around them further down the corridor. Clara kept glancing at the time on her phone every few seconds. Nearly midnight. Public transport would be slower now. St. Vincent's was across the city. Ethan noticed the growing panic she tried hard to hide. The lift doors opened with a soft chime. Clara stepped inside first, clutching her worn blazer tightly around herself while Ethan entered beside her. The mirrored walls reflected them standing there together in strange contrast. Him in an expensive tailored suit worth thousands. Her in worn black flats with tired blue eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Different worlds occupying the same silence for 30 seconds. Ethan looked at her reflection carefully. You should not take public transport alone this late. Clara glanced up immediately. I do it all the time. That does not make it safe. I cannot afford taxis from the city every night. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black keycard. Take the hotel car. Clara stared at him. What? The driver can take you to the hospital. She shook her head instantly. No, I cannot. Why? The question caught her off guard. Clara looked down at the polished elevator floor before answering quietly. Because people like me do not get things like that for free. Ethan went still beside her. People like me. The sentence landed heavier than she probably realized. Clara. It was the first time he had said her name aloud. Softly, calmly, yet hearing it in his voice made her heartbeat stumble unexpectedly. It is only a car ride. Nothing is only anything with wealthy men. The honesty slipped out before Clara could stop herself. Embarrassment flushed across her face immediately afterward. I am sorry. I did not mean. No, Ethan's voice remained quiet. Steady. You probably had reasons to learn that lesson. Clara looked away again, ashamed now for sounding rude. But Ethan did not appear offended. If anything, he looked thoughtful. The lift doors opened onto the ground floor lobby where only a few hotel staff remained beneath dimmed chandelier lights. Ethan stepped aside, allowing Clara to walk out first. She moved quickly toward the entrance doors, clearly intending to leave before this strange connection between them became any more complicated. But halfway across the lobby, Ethan spoke again behind her. Clara. She stopped instinctively and turned back. Ethan walked toward her slowly through the golden hotel light, his expression unreadable. Then without another word, he removed his dark suit jacket and held it out toward her. Clara blinked in confusion. What are you doing? It is cold outside. Clara glanced through the glass entrance where rain had started falling heavily across the Sydney streets sometime during the evening. She had not even noticed. I am fine, she whispered automatically. Ethan looked at her worn thin blazer, her trembling tired hands, the exhaustion she kept trying to hide beneath politeness. No, he said gently. You are not. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved beneath the soft hotel lights while rain streaked down the enormous glass windows behind them. Then very carefully, Clara accepted the jacket from his hands. The jacket still carried traces of cedarwood cologne and the faint warmth of Ethan's body when Clara slipped it carefully over her shoulders. The expensive fabric felt impossibly soft against her tired skin, heavier than the cheap coats she usually found in discount stores near Central Station. For a strange second, standing beneath the golden hotel lights while rain battered the glass outside. Clara forgot how exhausted she was. Ethan watched her quietly as she adjusted the sleeves. His jacket nearly swallowed her smaller frame completely. Something about that image settled unexpectedly deep beneath his ribs. Dangerous. Human. Real. Clara lowered her eyes almost immediately after noticing him looking at her again. "I will return it," she murmured softly. "You can give it to reception tomorrow." Ethan should have left then. He knew that. His assistant was probably searching the hotel by now. Investors expected follow-up meetings in the morning. His schedule tomorrow had already been planned down to 5-minute intervals. Yet somehow he still found himself standing there beside a girl carrying hospital visitor stickers in her pocket and exhaustion in her bones. "The car is waiting outside," he said quietly. Clara hesitated again. Every instinct she had built over the years warned her to avoid becoming dependent on wealthy kindness. People always expected repayment eventually. Maybe not immediately, maybe not obviously, but eventually. Ethan seemed to notice the conflict flickering across her face. "No conditions," he said gently. "Just a ride to the hospital." Clara looked at him properly, then for the first time since accepting the jacket. Rainwater streamed down the enormous lobby windows behind him, while soft piano music drifted faintly through the nearly empty hotel. He looked tired too suddenly. Not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying a loneliness too expensive for ordinary people to notice. "Thank you," she whispered finally. Ethan nodded once toward the entrance where a black luxury sedan waited beneath the covered driveway outside. "Your sister should not have to wait longer because Sydney traffic is miserable." The smallest laugh escaped Clara before she could stop it. Quiet, soft, real. Ethan stared at her in mild surprise. It was the first genuine sound of ease he had heard from her all night. Clara immediately looked embarrassed afterward, brushing loose blonde strands behind one ear. "Sorry." There was that word again. Ethan almost smiled this time. "You apologize more than anyone I have ever met." Clara blinked at him uncertainly. "I do. Constantly." A faint flush colored her cheeks beneath the warm lobby light. "People get annoyed when you make life harder for them." Ethan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Who taught you that?" The question landed deeper than Clara expected. She looked away quickly toward the rain outside. "Life." Ethan held her gaze for 1 second longer before quietly stepping aside toward the entrance. The hotel doorman opened the glass doors immediately as cool rain-scented air drifted inside. Sydney glittered beyond the covered driveway, wet streets reflecting gold and white city lights beneath the storm. The driver hurried to open the rear passenger door for Clara. She stopped beside the car uncertainly before turning back one final time. Ethan remained beneath the hotel canopy, watching her quietly with one hand tucked into his trouser pocket. Without his jacket, the sharp lines of his white dress shirt softened him somehow. Less billionaire, more man. Clara tightened the jacket slightly around herself. "Good night, Mr. Calloway." Ethan's eyes lingered on her for a strange, suspended moment before he answered softly, "Good night, Clara." Hearing her name in his voice again did something unsettling to her heartbeat. Clara quickly stepped into the car before she could think too much about it. The door closed gently behind her, shutting out the rain and most of the city noise immediately. As the sedan pulled away from the hotel entrance, Clara glanced back instinctively through the rain-streaked window. Ethan still stood beneath the golden lights watching the car disappear into Sydney traffic. He remained there several seconds after it vanished completely. "Mr. Calloway?" His assistant's voice behind him finally broke the silence. Ethan looked away from the street slowly. "What?" The older man approached, carefully holding a tablet filled with tomorrow's schedule updates. "The board members from Singapore are asking about breakfast tomorrow morning." Ethan loosened another button at his collar absently. "Reschedule it." His assistant blinked in surprise. "Reschedule. Push it to the afternoon." "Sir, that meeting took 6 weeks to arrange." Ethan glanced once more toward the rain-soaked road, where the car carrying Clara had disappeared moments earlier. "Then they can wait a few more hours." The assistant stared at him carefully now, confusion obvious in his expression. Ethan never rearranged important meetings without reason. Ever. "Is everything all right?" Ethan turned back toward the glowing hotel lobby. "No," he answered quietly, almost to himself. "That is the problem." Meanwhile, Clara sat silently in the back seat while rain blurred the city lights outside into soft streaks of gold and white. The warmth inside the luxury car felt almost unreal after years of crowded trains and late-night bus rides home from work. She held Ethan's jacket carefully folded across her lap now, fingertips brushing the expensive dark fabric absent-mindedly. Her reflection in the tinted window looked unfamiliar somehow. Softer, less guarded. Dangerous thoughts. Clara immediately pushed them away. Men like Ethan Calloway did not belong in stories like hers. Wealthy men noticed beautiful women every day. Tonight meant nothing to him beyond temporary kindness. She knew better than to mistake gentleness for attachment. Yet despite every logical warning inside her head, she still remembered the way he looked at her when she mentioned Ivy. Not pity. Concern. Genuine concern. The driver's calm voice interrupted her thoughts. St. Vincent's Hospital, miss? Clara nodded quickly. Yes, thank you. 20 minutes later, the sedan pulled beneath the emergency entrance canopy where fluorescent hospital lights reflected across wet pavement. Clara stepped out quickly, clutching Ethan's jacket around herself against the cold drizzle. Would you like me to wait? The driver asked politely. No, thank you. Clara hesitated briefly before adding, please tell Mr. Calloway thank you for the ride. The driver smiled faintly. Of course. Inside the hospital, everything smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. Night nurses moved quietly through pale corridors while monitors beeped softly behind half-closed patient room doors. Clara hurried toward the cardiac unit with exhaustion pressing heavily against her shoulders now. She reached Ivy's room and stopped immediately upon seeing her younger sister sitting upright in bed, pale but smiling weakly beneath dim bedside lighting. Relief nearly made Clara dizzy. Hey, Ivy whispered softly. Clara crossed the room instantly and wrapped her arms carefully around her sister. You scared me. Ivy laughed faintly against her shoulder. Sorry. Clara pulled back just enough to study her face anxiously. What happened? Reaction to the medication change, Ivy admitted quietly. The doctors adjusted it already. Clara exhaled shakily and brushed blonde hair gently away from Ivy's forehead. You could have texted me that part before making me panic. You looked stressed enough already. Then Ivy noticed the oversized dark jacket draped around Clara's shoulders and blinked slowly. That definitely is not your coat. Clara froze for half a second too long. Ivy's tired smile widened immediately despite her exhaustion. Clara Whitmore, she whispered dramatically. Did a man finally happen to you? Clara laughed softly despite herself and looked away toward the rain tapping gently against the hospital windows. But somewhere across the city, inside a silent penthouse apartment overlooking Sydney Harbor, Ethan Calloway stood alone beside his own floor-to-ceiling windows, thinking about a girl who apologized too much and carried everyone else's pain like it belonged entirely to her. Morning sunlight spilled softly across the Sydney skyline, turning the harbor water pale gold beneath drifting clouds, while Clara sat half asleep beside Ivy's hospital bed, holding a paper cup of vending machine coffee that had long gone cold. She had not meant to stay overnight. But sometime around 3 in the morning, exhaustion won against the uncomfortable plastic chair beside the bed. Ivy still slept peacefully now, one arm curled beneath the thin hospital blanket, while heart monitors beeped softly beside her. Clara brushed loose blonde hair away from her face and checked the time on her phone. 7:15. Panic immediately tightened in her chest. She was late. Again. Clara stood too quickly, nearly dropping the coffee cup onto the hospital floor. Careful, Ivy murmured sleepily without opening her eyes. Clara exhaled shakily. I have to go. Ivy opened one eye slowly and smiled faintly. Your billionaire boyfriend will survive one late morning. Clara nearly choked on cold coffee. He is not my boyfriend. MMHM. Ivy settled deeper into the pillow with obvious amusement. That is why you are still wearing his jacket. Clara glanced down automatically. Ethan's dark suit jacket remained draped around her shoulders exactly where she had fallen asleep hours earlier. Somehow the faint cedarwood scent still lingered in the expensive fabric. Clara quickly removed it and folded it neatly over her arm. I just forgot to take it off. Ivy gave her a dramatic look. You literally sleep-hugged it. Ivy. Her sister laughed softly before coughing again. Clara's expression immediately softened with concern. Are you okay? I am fine. Ivy reached for Clara's hand briefly. Go to work before another scary fashion woman yells at you. Clara sighed tiredly. Vanessa is going to kill me. No, Ivy murmured gently. She is just miserable. Clara squeezed her sister's hand once before grabbing her bag and hurrying toward the door. I will come back tonight after my diner shift. Bring snacks, Ivy called sleepily after her. Hospital jelly tastes like sadness. Nearly 40 minutes later, Clara rushed through the employee entrance of Callaway Luxe headquarters in downtown Sydney, with her hair still slightly damp from the hospital bathroom sink and Ethan's jacket carefully folded over one arm. The towering glass building stretched high above the city streets, reflecting bright morning sunlight across polished steel and marble. Clara rarely worked inside the actual corporate offices. Most of her shifts involved event preparation or temporary backstage assistance. But today the company was hosting a private luxury campaign fitting for international investors, and extra staff had been called in early. Clara stepped into the employee lift while trying unsuccessfully to catch her breath. Her flats squeaked faintly against the polished floor from the rainwater outside. Whitmore. Clara closed her eyes briefly at the sound of Vanessa's voice waiting for her the moment the lift doors opened onto the styling department floor. Nice of you to finally arrive. Several assistants nearby immediately went quiet. Clara tightened her grip on her bag. I am sorry. My sister was in hospital. Vanessa crossed her arms sharply. And somehow that becomes my problem, because... Clara lowered her eyes instantly. It does not. Exactly. Vanessa glanced briefly at the folded dark jacket over Clara's arm. Her expression changed immediately. Interesting coat. Clara's stomach tightened. It belongs to Mr. Callaway. Nearby assistants exchanged quick looks instantly. Vanessa stared at her for one long, uncomfortable second before laughing softly. Of course it does. Clara recognized that tone immediately. Dangerous gossip disguised as amusement. He lent it to me because it was raining, Clara explained quietly. Vanessa stepped closer. You expect me to believe Sydney's most emotionally unavailable billionaire suddenly started handing out jackets to backstage assistants? Heat crept across Clara's face. Nothing happened. Please. Vanessa looked openly amused now. Girls throw themselves at Ethan Callaway constantly. Do not insult my intelligence pretending you accidentally became special overnight. Clara felt every nearby pair of eyes turning toward her now. Embarrassment burned hot beneath her skin. I never said I was special. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. Then maybe stop acting like it. Silence spread sharply across the styling floor. Clara stood perfectly still, clutching Ethan's folded jacket tighter against herself, while humiliation crawled painfully up her throat. She hated scenes, hated attention, hated feeling small in crowded rooms. Vanessa seemed to sense that weakness immediately. Do you know what happens to girls who mistake wealthy men's temporary interest for affection? She continued smoothly. They embarrass themselves publicly. Clara swallowed hard. I am just trying to work. Then focus on work instead of flirting with the boss. That is enough. The deep male voice cut cleanly across the room before Clara could answer. Every conversation stopped instantly. Clara froze. Slowly, she turned toward the glass entrance doors at the far end of the styling department. Ethan Callaway stood there beside two board executives and his assistant, dressed once again in a sharply tailored dark suit that somehow made the entire room feel quieter the moment he entered it. His gaze rested directly on Vanessa now. Cold, controlled, dangerous in the calmest possible way. Vanessa's face lost color almost immediately. Mr. Callaway, she said quickly. We were just discussing scheduling issues. Ethan walked further into the room without looking away from her. Really? It was not a question. Clara's pulse hammered painfully beneath her ribs. She had not expected to see him again this soon. Especially not like this. Bright morning lights spilled across the polished floor, while employees pretended very hard not to stare openly at the unfolding tension. Ethan stopped beside Clara at a distance close enough for her to catch the faint scent of cedarwood and coffee again. His eyes flickered briefly toward the folded jacket in her arms before returning calmly to Vanessa. I heard enough, he said quietly. Vanessa forced a tight smile. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. No, Ethan's voice remained calm. The misunderstanding is believing professionalism gives you permission to humiliate employees publicly. The silence afterward felt enormous. Clara stared down at the floor, stunned. Nobody defended assistants. Especially not billionaires. Vanessa looked genuinely rattled now. I was simply trying to maintain standards. Ethan glanced toward Clara finally. His expression softened almost invisibly for 1 second before returning cold again. Then perhaps start by maintaining your own. The room fell completely silent. Vanessa's mouth opened slightly before closing again without words. Ethan turned toward Clara then, his voice quieter now. Did your sister recover all right? Clara looked up in surprise. The fact that he remembered unsettled her more than it should have. She is stable, Clara answered softly. Thank you. Ethan nodded once. Good. Then his eyes dropped briefly toward the jacket folded carefully in her arms. You can keep that for today. It is colder outside than people realize. The words sounded simple enough, but the way several employees immediately stared at Clara afterward made her chest tighten with dread. Because in offices like this, kindness from powerful men never stayed private for long. The atmosphere inside the styling department changed completely after Ethan walked away. Conversations resumed eventually, but softer now, more cautious. Employees kept sneaking glances toward Clara while pretending not to. The fluorescent office lights suddenly felt too bright against her tired eyes. She stood frozen for several seconds after Ethan disappeared behind the glass conference corridor with the executives, still clutching his jacket against herself like she had forgotten how to move properly. Vanessa recovered first. Of course she did. Women like her survived by adapting quickly whenever power shifted direction. Everyone back to work, she snapped sharply, spinning toward the assistants gathered nearby. The room scattered instantly into motion again. Garment racks rolled across polished floors. Tablets lit up with schedule updates. Coffee cups disappeared from desks as people hurried to look productive. But tension lingered in the air like static after lightning. Clara quietly placed Ethan's jacket over the back of her chair near the fitting area before beginning inventory checks on incoming campaign pieces. Her hands moved automatically through the routine while her mind replayed the last few minutes over and over again. Did your sister recover all right? The fact that he remembered Ivy unsettled her more than anything else. Wealthy men remembered names when those names benefited them somehow. Not details from exhausted conversations near flower boxes at midnight. Mia slipped quietly beside her carrying garment folders. Okay, she whispered dramatically. You absolutely have to tell me what is happening. Clara nearly dropped a clipboard. Nothing is happening. The man publicly destroyed Vanessa for you. Clara lowered her voice immediately. He did not do it for me. Then why? Clara had no answer for that. Mia leaned closer with wide eyes. Do you know how many women in this building have been trying to get Ethan Calloway's attention for years? Clara exhaled quietly. I'm not trying to get his attention. That might actually be why you have it. Before Clara could respond, Vanessa approached again in sharp heels clicking against the floor. Her expression remained perfectly controlled now, which somehow felt more dangerous than yelling. Whitmore, she said coldly. Campaign fitting room 3. International investors arrive in 20 minutes. Clara nodded immediately and hurried toward the fitting suites carrying garment lists against her chest. The fitting rooms occupied the quieter east side of the Callaway Luxe headquarters, far removed from the noisy styling floor. Soft instrumental music drifted through hidden speakers, while floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Sydney Harbor beneath pale morning clouds. Everything inside the company reflected controlled luxury. Marble surfaces, cream carpets, glass walls polished spotless every morning before sunrise. Clara entered fitting room 3 and began organizing designer samples onto rolling racks with practiced efficiency. Silk gowns, tailored coats, jewelry displays worth more money than she could imagine. Her reflection moved faintly across mirrored walls while she worked quickly to avoid falling behind schedule. Nearly an hour passed before the fitting suite doors opened unexpectedly behind her. Clara looked up automatically. Ethan stepped inside alone. No executives. No assistant. Just him in another dark tailored suit with sleeves slightly rolled now, as if he had already survived a difficult morning. Clara straightened immediately. Mr. Calloway. Ethan glanced briefly around the prepared fitting room before looking back at her. You are early. Clara blinked in confusion. For what? The investor fitting session. Oh. She adjusted a row of garment hangers nervously. Vanessa said I was late earlier. Ethan's expression cooled slightly at the mention of Vanessa's name. You stayed at the hospital overnight. Clara froze softly. How did you know that? Ethan realized too late how carefully he had been paying attention. You looked exhausted, he answered smoothly, and you were still wearing the same clothes. Clara glanced down at herself instinctively. Heat touched her cheeks again. She had changed nothing except brushing her hair in the hospital bathroom mirror before rushing to work. Sorry. Ethan almost sighed. There was that word again. You do not need to apologize for taking care of your sister. Clara looked away quietly, fingers tightening around the clipboard in her hands. Most employers disagree. Ethan studied her face carefully then. The exhaustion, the guarded politeness, the way she constantly prepared herself to be inconvenient. Something about it bothered him more every time he noticed it. Callaway Lux is not supposed to operate like that, he said quietly. Clara gave a small, uncertain smile. Maybe not officially. Before Ethan could answer, the fitting room doors opened again as several international investors entered laughing loudly beside company executives. Expensive perfume and conversation immediately filled the once quiet room. Ethan's entire posture changed almost instantly. Straighter, colder, controlled again. Clara noticed it immediately, like watching someone slide armor back into place. Mr. Callaway, one investor greeted warmly. Beautiful offices as always. Ethan nodded politely. Thank you for coming. Clara stepped quietly aside near the garment racks, returning to invisible assistant mode while executives discussed expansion contracts and luxury campaign projections around her. She preferred it that way. Invisible people survived easier. Yet despite the busy room filling with voices and movement, Clara gradually realized something unsettling. Ethan kept noticing her anyway. Small things. The way she handed tea to an older investor before he asked. The way she fixed a loose display light nobody else bothered addressing. The way she discreetly offered tissues to a nervous junior model moments before a presentation fitting. Ethan watched all of it while pretending not to. Nearly 2 hours later, the investor session finally ended. The executives filtered toward the conference wing while assistants began clearing sample garments from the fitting suite. Clara bent down beside an open storage case, searching for missing inventory tags when a familiar voice behind her suddenly spoke. You missed breakfast. Clara startled slightly and turned. Ethan stood beside the window overlooking the harbor now, holding 2 takeaway coffee cups. What? He walked closer and held one cup toward her. You look like someone surviving entirely on caffeine and stubbornness. Clara stared at the coffee. You bought me coffee? Do not sound so alarmed. The corner of his mouth almost lifted again. Almost. Slowly, Clara accepted the warm cup from his hand. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange. Tiny contact, yet enough to send another strange rush of awareness through her chest. Thank you, she murmured softly. Ethan leaned casually against the window beside her while Sydney Harbor glittered pale blue behind him. How is your sister this morning? Clara wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup instinctively. Better. Her voice softened immediately again at the mention of Ivy. The doctors adjusted her medication. Ethan nodded once. Good. Silence settled between them. But unlike earlier silences, this one felt strangely comfortable. Gentle. Clara took a cautious sip of coffee and closed her eyes briefly in relief. Real coffee, not vending machine sludge. Ethan watched the tiny reaction carefully. That good. Clara laughed softly before she could stop herself. You have no idea. The sound hit Ethan unexpectedly hard. Her laugh did not sound polished or flirtatious. It sounded rare, like something life had not given her many reasons to do lately. And for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, Ethan Callaway found himself genuinely smiling back. For a few quiet seconds, the fitting suite no longer felt like part of a billion-dollar fashion company. It felt strangely normal. Clara stood beside the harbor windows holding warm coffee between both hands while soft winter sunlight reflected across the water outside. Ethan leaned against the marble ledge nearby, watching her laugh fade into an embarrassed smile as though she had forgotten people could hear happiness in her voice. Neither of them noticed the silent stretching comfortably between them until the fitting room doors burst open again. Mr. Callaway, the legal team is waiting upstairs. Ethan's assistant stopped abruptly the moment he saw them standing together near the windows. Clara instantly stepped back half a pace on instinct. The movement was small, but Ethan noticed it immediately, creating distance before someone else could misunderstand. Tell them 5 minutes, Ethan said calmly without taking his eyes off Clara. His assistant hesitated. Sir, they said the Tokyo investors are already online. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. 5 minutes. Yes, sir. The door closed again. Silence returned. Clara stared down into her coffee cup. You should probably go. Ethan studied her quietly. You are very quick to send people away. Clara gave a faint shrug. People with important lives usually leave eventually anyway. The honesty of the sentence settled unexpectedly heavily between them. Ethan looked toward the glittering harbor outside before answering softly. That sounds personal. Clara traced one fingertip along the coffee lid absently. It is realistic. Ethan realized then that Clara did not expect permanence from anyone. Not kindness. Not help. Not people. Maybe life had taught her everything temporary eventually disappeared. Not everyone leaves, he said quietly. Clara almost smiled sadly at that. Most do. Another silence followed. But this one felt more fragile somehow. Like both of them had wandered accidentally too close to something honest. Ethan straightened from the window finally. Walk with me. Clara blinked. What? I need to go upstairs before my assistant starts having heart failure. A faint trace of humor touched his voice again. You can return my jacket while we walk. Clara glanced down at the dark suit jacket still draped carefully across the back of her chair. Somehow she had forgotten she was still borrowing it. Right. She set down the coffee cup and picked up the jacket carefully before following him out into the quieter executive corridor. The upper floors of Callaway Luxe felt completely different from the busy styling departments below. Thick carpets softened every footstep. Glass offices overlooked the harbor through endless windows, while muted conversations drifted faintly through partially closed conference doors. Clara walked half a step behind Ethan automatically, aware of curious glances from executives passing in tailored suits. She suddenly felt painfully conscious of her simple blouse, tired eyes, and worn flats against all this polished wealth. Ethan seemed to sense her discomfort without looking directly at her. Relax. Clara glanced up uncertainly. I am relaxed. No, Ethan replied calmly. You look like someone walking through a museum terrified of touching anything expensive. To Clara's horror, a soft laugh escaped her again. Ethan glanced sideways briefly at the sound. There it was. That rare little laugh that felt strangely victorious every time he managed to hear it. They reached the private executive lift lobby, where sunlight poured across polished marble floors. Clara carefully held out the folded jacket toward him. Thank you for letting me borrow it. Ethan looked at the jacket, but did not take it immediately. Did you sleep at all? Clara blinked at the sudden question. A little. That means no. I slept in a hospital chair, she admitted quietly. Ethan exhaled softly through his nose. That definitely means no. Clara lowered her eyes again with a tired smile. I have had worse nights. Ethan believed that instantly. The lift doors opened beside them with a quiet chime, but before either stepped inside, the overhead lights flickered once sharply. Then again, Clara frowned slightly. Not another power issue. Almost on cue, every light across the executive corridor shut off completely. The lift stopped halfway open with a dull mechanical sound, while emergency backup systems failed to activate immediately this time. Darkness swallowed the corridor. Somewhere further down the floor, confused voices echoed faintly through the building. Clara instinctively reached one hand outward in surprise, fingers brushing accidentally against Ethan's wrist in the dark. Both of them froze for one strange second. Sorry, Clara whispered immediately, trying to pull back. Ethan's hand closed gently around hers. Before she could. Not forcefully. Just enough to steady her balance in the darkness. Careful, he said quietly. The emergency lights finally flickered on seconds later, bathing the corridor in dim amber shadows similar to the night before at the gala. But neither of them moved apart immediately. Clara looked down slowly at his hand around hers. Warm, steady, unexpectedly careful. Ethan released her gently the moment he realized how close they were standing. Sorry, he said softly this time. Clara stared at him in surprise. Billionaires apologizing for accidental hand contact definitely was not normal. The dim emergency lighting softened the sharp lines of Ethan's face, while distant thunder rolled faintly outside somewhere across the harbor. For the first time since meeting him, Clara realized something unsettling. Ethan looked lonely. Not physically alone. Emotionally alone. The kind of loneliness hidden behind expensive watches and perfectly controlled expressions. You hate this building sometimes, do not you? The question escaped Clara before she could stop herself. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. What makes you think that? Clara glanced toward the endless rows of silent glass offices stretching behind them. You always look relieved when you leave crowded rooms. Ethan stared at her quietly for a long moment. Most people noticed his money first, or his influence, or his last name. Clara somehow noticed exhaustion instead. You observe too much, he murmured finally. Clara gave the faintest shrug. Invisible people usually do. The sentence hit harder than she intended. Ethan looked directly at her beneath the soft amber emergency lights. You are not invisible, Clara. Her heartbeat stumbled painfully at the quiet certainty in his voice. Before she could respond, his assistant hurried around the corridor corner, looking visibly stressed. There you are. The backup generators are restarting now. His eyes flickered briefly between Ethan and Clara standing unusually close together beneath the emergency lights before professional composure returned instantly. The Tokyo investors are still waiting. Ethan's expression cooled slightly again as reality returned around them. The elevators hummed back to life moments later, while bright overhead lighting flooded the corridor once more. Whatever fragile thing had existed in the dim hallway disappeared with the shadows. Clara stepped back immediately, creating distance again. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. You should eat something besides coffee today, he said quietly before stepping toward the lift. Clara almost smiled despite herself. That sounded strangely bossy. Ethan paused beside the open lift doors and looked at her one final time. Maybe I am learning concern and bossiness are not always different things. Then the lift doors closed between them, leaving Clara alone in the bright corridor with her pulse still refusing to settle properly. By late afternoon, the rain had returned to Sydney in soft silver waves against the glass walls of Callaway Lux headquarters. Clara stood alone in the sample archive room, sorting returned campaign pieces while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the harbor skyline. The archive level sat quieter than the rest of the building, hidden beneath the executive floors where endless meetings and investor presentations continued without pause. Clara preferred it down here. Quiet rooms asked fewer questions. She carefully hung a cream silk gown onto the storage rack before rubbing one hand across her tired eyes. Her body felt heavy now. Too little sleep. Too much stress. Too many hours pretending everything was manageable. Yet despite the exhaustion dragging at her shoulders, her mind kept replaying moments from the hallway earlier. You are not invisible, Clara. The words refused to leave her alone. She hated that they mattered. Hated that Ethan Callaway somehow saw through walls she had spent years building carefully around herself. You missed lunch again. Clara startled slightly at Mia's voice appearing from the doorway. The younger assistant stepped inside, carrying a paper takeaway bag that smelled faintly of toasted sandwiches. I brought you food before you collapsed dramatically into a garment rack. Clara managed a tired smile. You are a good person. I know. Mia dropped onto one of the storage stools and lowered her voice immediately. The entire building is talking about you. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Wonderful. Vanessa is furious. Also wonderful. Mia grinned despite herself before growing more serious. People noticed Mr. Callaway asking about your sister. Clara placed another garment carefully onto the rack. People need hobbies. People need gossip, Mia corrected gently. Especially in buildings full of rich executives with boring marriages. Clara laughed softly despite herself. Then her phone vibrated suddenly against the storage table. The moment she saw the hospital number across the screen, every trace of humor vanished from her face. Mia noticed immediately. What is wrong? Clara answered quickly. Hello. Her expression changed within seconds. Fear moved silently across her features while she listened. A pause. Is she all right? Mia stood immediately now, concern replacing curiosity. Clara pressed one hand against the table edge as though steadying herself physically. I am coming now. The call ended. Clara stared down at the dark phone screen for one terrible second before breathing shakily. Ivy collapsed during another medication reaction. Mia grabbed her bag instantly. Go. Clara blinked rapidly. Vanessa will fire me. Your sister is in hospital. I cannot lose this job too. Mia stared at her in disbelief. Clara. Before Clara could answer, footsteps echoed outside the archive room corridor. Vanessa appeared moments later carrying inventory tablets against her chest. There you are. Her eyes narrowed immediately seeing Clara's expression. What happened now? Clara swallowed hard. The hospital called. My sister collapsed. Vanessa sighed sharply like someone inconvenienced by traffic. And Clara stared at her. And I need to leave. We have investor fittings tomorrow morning. Clara's fingers tightened around her phone. I know. Apparently not. Vanessa crossed her arms. Do you understand how replaceable temporary assistants are in this company? Mia stepped forward immediately. Her sister is in hospital. Vanessa barely glanced at her. And my responsibility is this company, not everyone's personal drama. Clara looked down quickly before humiliation reached her eyes again. I will make up the hours. That is not the point. Vanessa's voice sharpened. The point is reliability. Mr. Calloway may find your little tragic backstory interesting for the moment, but businesses are not run on sympathy. The words hit harder than Clara expected, not because she believed Ethan owed her anything, but because Vanessa made kindness sound humiliating somehow. Transactional. Cheap. I never asked anyone for sympathy, Clara said quietly. No, Vanessa replied smoothly. You just seem very good at attracting male rescue instincts. Mia made an angry sound beside her, but Clara remained still. Completely still. She had learned long ago that poor girls survive humiliation by enduring it silently. Vanessa stepped closer. Do not confuse temporary attention with importance, Clara. Men like Ethan Calloway notice beautiful women every day. They forget them just as quickly. Silence settled painfully through the archive room. Clara lowered her eyes toward the concrete floor because somehow that hurt more than she expected. Maybe because a small, dangerous part of her had started hoping Ethan saw something real in her. Something beyond temporary curiosity. Foolish. Stupid. Exactly the kind of fantasy women like her could not afford. That will be enough. Ethan's voice cut sharply through the doorway before anyone realized he was there. Every person in the room froze instantly. Ethan stood near the archive entrance, still wearing his dark suit from the executive meetings upstairs, though the sharp exhaustion beneath his eyes made it obvious the day had stretched far too long already. Clara's breath caught painfully for one terrible second. How much had he heard? Vanessa straightened immediately. Mr. Calloway. Ethan ignored her entirely at first. His eyes moved directly toward Clara instead. He noticed the fear in her face immediately. The humiliation. The instinctive shrinking into herself whenever someone spoke cruelly enough. Something cold settled deep inside his chest. Your sister? He asked softly. Clara nodded once. The hospital called. Ethan looked toward Mia briefly. What happened? Another medication reaction. Mia answered quietly before Vanessa could interrupt. Ethan turned finally toward Vanessa then. Calm. Controlled. Far more dangerous than anger. You seem deeply confused about something, he said quietly. Vanessa's posture stiffened instantly. Sir, compassion is not weakness. Silence swallowed the archive room completely. Ethan stepped further inside slowly, his gaze never leaving Vanessa now. And humiliating employees for having sick family members is not professionalism. Vanessa forced a brittle smile. I was only discussing scheduling concerns. No, Ethan's voice remained soft. You were discussing class. The words landed like glass breaking. Clara stared at him speechlessly. Ethan looked toward her again then, and his entire expression changed almost invisibly. Softer now. Human again. Go to the hospital. Clara blinked. What? Your sister needs you. But tomorrow's fittings will survive without one assistant. Ethan stepped closer. People matter more than schedules, Clara. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Nobody powerful had ever spoken like that around her before. Not sincerely. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan glanced briefly toward the rain hitting the narrow archive windows outside. Take the company car again. Clara immediately shook her head. I cannot keep accepting things from you. Ethan studied her quietly for one long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and held out a small silver access card toward her. This is not charity. Clara stared at the card uncertainly. What is it? Emergency staff transport authorization. It should have existed before tonight. The faintest trace of dry humor touched his voice. Consider it overdue management. Despite everything twisting painfully inside her chest, Clara almost smiled. So other staff can use it too? Ethan nodded. Anyone who needs it. That answer made it easier for Clara to accept the card because it no longer felt like a favor designed only for her. Ethan waited until she carefully took it before speaking again, softer this time. And Clara? She looked up. Do not let other people decide your value because they are angry nobody ever saw theirs. The room fell silent around them. Even Vanessa looked shaken now. Clara stared at Ethan beneath the dim archive lighting while rain tapped gently against the windows behind him. And for the first time in a very long time, someone's kindness no longer felt dangerous. It felt safe. Rain hammered softly against the windows of St. Vincent's Hospital while Clara sat outside the cardiac observation ward with both hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup she had not touched in nearly an hour. The fluorescent lights above cast pale shadows across the nearly empty corridor, turning exhausted faces gray beneath the quiet hum of hospital machines and distant trolley wheels. It was close to midnight again. Somehow hospitals always erase time. Clara stared blankly at the floor tiles while doctors moved in and out of Ivy's room behind closed doors. Her younger sister had stabilized for now, but the specialist's expression earlier still haunted her. More complications. More tests. More expenses Clara could not afford. She leaned forward slowly and pressed trembling fingers against her forehead. Exhaustion pulled heavily through every part of her body now. She had not eaten properly all day, had barely slept the night before. Yet the thing frightening her most was not exhaustion. It was hope. Because somewhere between rainstorms and quiet hallway conversations, Ethan Calloway had become the first person in years who made her feel less alone carrying all of this. And that terrified her. Clara looked down at the silver executive transport card still resting in her palm. The smooth metal reflected the corridor lights faintly. She remembered the way Ethan looked at her inside the archive room earlier. Not with pity, not with obligation. Like he genuinely meant every word he said. People matter more than schedules, Clara. Her throat tightened painfully at the memory. You should sleep for at least 20 minutes. Clara looked up quickly as Ivy's specialist approached, carrying a digital tablet beneath one arm. Dr. Harper looked exhausted too, though her voice remained kind. I am fine, Clara answered automatically. The doctor gave her a knowing look. That usually means the opposite. Clara managed a weak smile. Dr. Harper sat beside her briefly. Your sister is resting now. Clara exhaled shakily. Is she getting worse? The doctor hesitated carefully before answering. The medication reactions are becoming more frequent. Clara looked down at the untouched coffee in her hands. What happens next? There are newer treatment options available. Dr. Harper's expression softened slightly. But they are expensive. Of course they were. Clara nodded slowly because she no longer trusted herself to speak without crying. The doctor gently touched her arm once before standing again. Try to rest if you can. Then she disappeared quietly down the corridor. Clara remained motionless long after she left. Expensive. That word followed sick people everywhere. Expensive medicine. Expensive specialists. Expensive hope. She closed her eyes briefly, fighting the pressure building painfully behind them. Crying would not help Ivy. Panic would not help Ivy. Clara had spent years surviving by staying calm, no matter how frightened she felt inside. But tonight felt different somehow. Heavier. Her phone buzzed softly against the chair beside her. Clara glanced down expecting another hospital update. Instead, Ethan's name lit across the screen. Her heartbeat stumbled instantly. She stared at the message for several seconds before opening it carefully. How is your sister? Simple. Direct. Yet somehow warmer than most conversations she had experienced in years. Clara hesitated before typing slowly. Stable for now. Thank you for asking. 3 dots appeared almost immediately afterward. Have you eaten dinner? Clara actually laughed softly under her breath despite everything. Of course that was his next question. She typed back honestly before thinking too much. Coffee counts as dinner tonight. The reply came faster this time. That is not an acceptable answer. Clara shook her head faintly, the smallest smile touching her tired face. Before she could answer again, footsteps echoed softly down the corridor nearby. She looked up instinctively, then froze completely. Ethan stood at the far end of the hospital hallway holding a small paper takeaway bag in one hand while rainwater darkened the shoulders of his black coat. For one impossible second, Clara genuinely thought exhaustion was making her hallucinate. Ethan walked toward her slowly beneath the pale hospital lights, his expression softer than she had ever seen it inside the corporate offices. You were not joking about the coffee, he said quietly. Clara stared at him speechlessly. What are you doing here? Ethan glanced toward the cardiac ward doors briefly before looking back at her. You sounded tired. The simplicity of the answer nearly broke something inside her chest. You came to the hospital because I sounded tired? Ethan held up the takeaway bag slightly. Also because apparently your survival plan involves caffeine and emotional denial. Against all logic, Clara laughed softly again. The sound echoed quietly through the empty corridor. Ethan noticed immediately. There it is. That little laugh again. Somehow hearing it inside a hospital corridor at midnight affected him even more than before. Clara stood slowly from the plastic chair, still trying to process the fact that Ethan Calloway had somehow appeared inside her ordinary, exhausted reality, carrying takeaway food. You really did not have to come. Ethan's eyes settled gently on her face. I know. Silence followed softly between them while rain tapped against distant hospital windows. Clara suddenly became painfully aware of how tired she looked. Smudged mascara, wrinkled blouse, hair falling loose from hours spent leaning against hospital chairs. Yet Ethan looked at her exactly the same way he always had. Calmly, carefully, like none of those things mattered. He handed her the takeaway bag. Warmth immediately spread through her cold fingers. There is soup, he said quietly, and an actual sandwich, not vending machine sadness. Clara looked down at the bag before glancing back up at him slowly. How did you know hospital vending machines taste depressing? The faintest real smile touched Ethan's mouth then. Small, rare, enough to change his entire face for one brief second. My mother spent a lot of time in hospitals when I was younger. Clara blinked softly. Ethan almost never spoke personally about anything. Yet something in this quiet corridor made honesty feel easier somehow. Was she sick? Ethan looked toward the rain-streaked windows. Cancer. The same word Clara herself had spoken days earlier near the harbor corridor. This time the silence between them felt different. Not awkward. Shared. I am sorry, Clara whispered. Ethan gave a small shrug that failed completely at hiding old grief. I was 23. Clara studied him carefully beneath the pale hospital lights. Suddenly she understood the loneliness she kept seeing in him. The exhaustion behind expensive suits and controlled expressions. Maybe Ethan recognized pain in her because he carried his own quietly too. That is why you came, Clara realized softly. Ethan looked back at her. What do you mean? You know what hospital corridors feel like at night. Something shifted briefly across Ethan's expression then. Recognition maybe. Understanding. Yes, he answered quietly. I do. They stood there in silence afterward while distant thunder rolled softly outside across Sydney Harbor. Then unexpectedly, Clara's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. Not dramatic sobbing. Just quiet exhaustion finally cracking open after carrying too much for too long. Clara turned away immediately, embarrassed. Sorry. Ethan stepped closer instinctively. Hey. His voice lowered gently. Do not apologize for being overwhelmed. Clara pressed trembling fingers beneath her eyes quickly. I am usually better at holding it together. Ethan looked at her for one long quiet second before speaking softly. Maybe you should not have to hold everything together alone anymore. And standing there beneath cold hospital lights with rain falling endlessly outside, Clara realized no one had ever said something that kind to her before. Clara could not remember the last time someone stayed beside her during the hard parts instead of disappearing once things became complicated. Yet Ethan remained there in the quiet hospital corridor long after midnight, while rain softened against the windows and the city beyond faded into distant blurred lights. He sat beside her now on the uncomfortable plastic chairs outside Ivy's room, his expensive black coat folded neatly beside him, while Clara slowly ate warm soup from the takeaway container balanced carefully in her hands. The steam curled softly upward between them. For several quiet minutes, neither spoke. But unlike most silences in Clara's life, this one did not feel lonely. You were right, Clara murmured finally. Ethan glanced toward her. About what? Hospital vending machine food being depressing. The faintest smile touched his mouth again. Clara noticed something strange about Ethan's smiles. They appeared rarely, almost cautiously, like emotions he had forgotten how to use naturally. Yet whenever they surfaced, they transformed him completely. Softer, warmer. Human in a way magazines never captured. I try not to be wrong often, he replied dryly. Clara laughed quietly beneath her breath before taking another spoonful of soup. Ethan watched her carefully then. The way exhaustion still pulled at her shoulders, even while she tried pretending everything was manageable. The way she automatically glanced toward Ivy's room every few seconds. The way she apologized less around him now, without even realizing it. Dangerous observations. Personal ones. Ethan leaned back slightly against the hospital chair. Does your sister know how much you sacrifice for her? Clara stared down into the soup container for a moment before answering softly. I try very hard not to let her know. Ethan looked at her quietly. Why? Clara gave the faintest shrug. Because sick people already carry enough guilt. The answer hit Ethan harder than expected. He remembered his own mother apologizing constantly during chemotherapy. Apologizing for medical bills. For ruining schedules. For becoming fragile. He had hated it then. Hated how illness made good people feel burdensome simply for needing help. Ethan studied Clara's tired profile beneath the pale corridor lights. Somehow she carried herself exactly the same way. Like needing support made her inconvenient. You should not have to do this alone, he said quietly. Clara smiled sadly without looking up. That sentence sounds nice until real life sends. Invoices. Ethan fell silent at that. Because she was right. Hope without practical help could become cruel very quickly. Clara finished the last spoonful of soup and carefully folded the empty container closed before speaking again. Why are you really here? Ethan looked slightly surprised by the question. I told you already. No, Clara finally turned toward him fully now. You said you came because I sounded tired. But men like you do not leave billion-dollar meetings to sit in hospital corridors with temporary assistance. Ethan held her gaze for a long, quiet second. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind them, while distant footsteps echoed through the sleeping hospital wing. Finally, he answered honestly. Because when my mother was dying, everyone around us kept pretending strength mattered more than fear. Clara listened silently. Ethan's voice remained calm, but something old and painful moved quietly beneath it now. People brought flowers, sent expensive gifts, told us to stay positive. He looked toward the empty corridor ahead. But the only thing I actually remember was one nurse sitting beside me at 3 a.m. while I completely fell apart. Clara's chest tightened softly. Ethan rarely spoke emotionally. She could feel how unusual this honesty was for him. She told me exhausted people still deserve comfort. He continued quietly. For some reason that stayed with me. Clara looked down at her hand slowly. So now you do the same thing for strangers? You are not a stranger anymore. The words landed gently between them. Yet somehow they changed the air completely. Clara's heartbeat stumbled painfully again. Ethan seemed to realize the same thing immediately afterward because silence followed for several seconds. Neither quite knew how to navigate. Then suddenly the cardiac ward doors opened. Clara stood instantly. Dr. Harper stepped into the corridor holding updated scans against her chest. Her expression remained carefully professional, which somehow frightened Clara more than panic would have. Can we talk privately for a moment? Fear hit Clara immediately like cold water beneath her ribs. What happened? The doctor glanced briefly toward Ethan before answering carefully. Your sister is stable right now, but we need to discuss long-term treatment options. Clara nodded shakily and followed the doctor a few steps further down the corridor while Ethan remained seated quietly behind them. He watched Clara's shoulders stiffen with every sentence Dr. Harper spoke. New procedure, specialist consultations, surgical risks, costs. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized the exact moment Clara heard a number she could not possibly afford. Her entire body went still, completely still. Dr. Harper touched her arm gently before leaving her alone beside the corridor windows moments later. Clara remained there motionless, staring out into the rain-soaked Sydney skyline. Ethan stood slowly and walked toward her without speaking immediately. He stopped beside her beneath the pale hospital lights. How bad? Clara laughed softly then. Not happy, just tired enough to sound hollow. Do you ever notice how hospitals somehow make hope sound like a luxury item? Ethan looked at her carefully. Clara. She pressed trembling fingers against her mouth briefly before lowering them again. The surgery could help Ivy. Her voice cracked slightly despite obvious effort to control it. But I cannot afford it. Ethan felt something twist painfully inside his chest. Because she did not sound angry, just defeated. Like someone already preparing herself to survive disappointment again. How much? Clara immediately shook her head. No, Ethan frowned slightly. You do not even know what I was going to say. Yes, I do. Clara finally looked up at him then, blue eyes bright, with exhausted emotion beneath the fluorescent lights. And I cannot let you fix this for me. Ethan stepped closer carefully. Why? Clara swallowed hard. Because people like me do not survive by owing powerful men impossible debts. The sentence hurt more than she intended. Ethan saw it immediately in her face. Fear. Not of him specifically. Of dependence itself. Of becoming trapped inside gratitude she could never repay. Clara, he said softly, I am not trying to buy anything from you. I know. Her voice broke almost invisibly. That is what scares me. Silence settled heavily between them while rain streaked endlessly down the windows behind their reflections. Ethan looked at her for one long, quiet moment before reaching carefully into his coat pocket. Clara stiffened slightly, expecting money. Instead, Ethan held out a folded card. This is Dr. Lewis Hargrove in Melbourne, he said quietly. He runs a cardiac program that takes difficult valve cases through hospital referrals and charity funding. I can make sure Dr. Harper has the contact. Nothing goes through me. Nothing is owed to me. Clara stared down at the card uncertainly. Why are you helping me? Ethan's expression softened in a way she had never seen before. Honest now. Unprotected. Because somewhere along the way, he said quietly, you started mattering to me more than you were supposed to. But I need you to know this matters even if you never choose me. The world seemed to stop breathing for one suspended second inside that silent hospital corridor. Clara stared at him speechlessly while rain whispered against the glass and distant machines beeped softly through the sleeping ward behind them. For the first time in years, help did not feel like a hook hidden inside kindness. It felt like an open door she could walk through on her own terms. 3 months later, spring sunlight spilled across Sydney Harbor in soft gold ribbons while cameras flashed endlessly inside the renovated ballroom of the Crown Meridian Hotel. It was the same hotel where Clara Whitmore's life had shifted on a rainy night she had once tried very hard to forget. But tonight the ballroom felt different. Warmer. Softer. Less like a room designed to remind ordinary people they did not belong. White orchids lined the mirrored runway beneath crystal chandeliers. Musicians played low instrumental music near the grand staircase. Reporters crowded near the entrance, discussing the new Callaway Cardiac Access Fund, a program that would pay for specialist referrals, transport, temporary housing, and recovery support for families who usually fell through the cracks between hospital paperwork and real life. The press release called it a corporate initiative. Clara knew better. It had started with one hospital corridor, one untouched cup of coffee, and one sentence Ethan had not been able to forget: expensive hope. But Clara had made one thing very clear from the beginning. Ivy's treatment could not become a romantic favor. It had to become something other families could use too. Ethan had listened. Really listened. He had brought in doctors, social workers, legal teams, and hospital administrators. Clara had sat in meetings even when her hands shook beneath the table, correcting wealthy executives when they used words like beneficiaries as if they were discussing numbers instead of frightened people waiting outside operating rooms. Tonight was the first public fundraiser for that program. And for the first time in years, Clara was not standing backstage because someone had ordered her to clean up after everyone else. She stood there because she had chosen to. In the dressing room behind the ballroom, Clara adjusted the delicate silver sleeve of her gown beneath soft lights, while stylists moved around her with unusual gentleness. The gown was elegant, but not because it looked expensive. It mattered because Clara had helped design the campaign around it. Each silver thread represented a patient story collected from families who had learned to be brave in waiting rooms. You are doing that thing again, Ivy said from the doorway. Clara glanced toward the mirror. Her younger sister stood there in a pale blue dress, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe. She was still thinner than Clara wanted, still recovering, still carrying a scar beneath the fabric that no gown could erase. But color had returned to her cheeks. Her breathing no longer sounded like a secret battle. The Melbourne surgery had not been magic. Recovery had been painful, frightening, slow. There had been nights Clara had cried silently in hospital bathrooms, so Ivy would not see. But Ivy was here, alive, smiling. That alone felt like a miracle Clara was afraid to touch too tightly. What thing? Clara asked softly. Ivy grinned. Pretending you are calm while emotionally falling apart inside. I am not falling apart. You have adjusted that bracelet 6 times. Clara looked down and realized Ivy was right. Some habits survived happiness. Her hands still searched for something to fix whenever life felt too large. Ivy crossed the room and gently took Clara's hands away from the bracelet. You look beautiful. Clara's expression softened. You only say that because you love me. No, Ivy replied solemnly. I say it because you finally look like someone who knows she is allowed to take up space. The words caught Clara off guard. For a moment, the noise of the ballroom outside seemed to fade. Clara looked at her sister in the mirror and saw not just Ivy's recovery, but the long road behind them. Cold buses after midnight. Hospital vending machines. Bills stacked beside cheap takeaway containers. Apologies swallowed before they became tears. Years of Clara shrinking herself so life would not punish her for needing too much. I still get scared, Clara admitted. Ivy squeezed her hands. I know, but scared is not the same as small. A soft knock interrupted them before Clara could answer. The dressing room door opened slowly, and Ethan stood beneath the warm hallway light in a black tuxedo, looking far less untouchable than the magazines had always made him seem. For one suspended second, he simply looked at Clara, really looked at her. The silver gown caught the light around her shoulders, but it was not the gown that made him go still. It was the peace in her face. Not perfect peace, not fairy tale peace, something stronger. The kind earned by someone who had survived being underestimated and had decided not to disappear anymore. Ivy noticed the silence instantly and smirked. I am suddenly feeling very healthy, she announced. I will go make sure the rich people remember how to sit down. Ivy, Clara warned. But Ivy was already slipping past Ethan into the hallway. Try not to emotionally stare at each other for too long. The entire cardiac program is waiting. The door closed behind her. Clara laughed softly, embarrassed despite herself. She is impossible. She is your sister, Ethan said, stepping closer. That explains a lot. Clara shook her head, but her smile remained. Ethan stopped in front of her, his expression warm beneath the dressing room lights. How is she feeling? Excited, Clara said. Her eyes softened toward the closed door. Dr. Harper says her recovery is ahead of schedule. Ethan nodded, relief moving quietly across his face. Ivy mattered to him now too, not because she was part of Clara's tragic backstory, but because love had a way of widening a person's world when it was real. A comfortable silence settled between them. Clara looked down at her hands. I heard Vanessa resigned. She was given the choice after HR finished the review, Ethan said. His voice stayed calm, but there was steel beneath it. Mia gave a statement. So did 3 other assistants. Clara absorbed that quietly. Part of her had expected Vanessa to remain untouched, the way people with sharper titles often did. But the review had changed more than one person's job. Callaway Lux now had an anonymous reporting line, paid emergency leave for temporary staff, and transport support for workers leaving late-night events. They were small policies on paper. To people like Clara, they were the difference between being invisible and being protected. I am glad, Clara said. Then, after a pause, not because I wanted her destroyed. I know. I just wanted someone to say it was wrong. Ethan's expression softened. It was wrong. Those 3 words were simple. They still mattered. Clara breathed them in slowly, as if some old part of her had been waiting years to hear them. Outside the ballroom, applause rose as the first speaker walked on stage. Clara's name would be announced soon. That was the part making her nervous. Not the cameras. Not the dress. The speech. She had rewritten it 4 times. Every version had sounded too polished until Ivy finally told her, just tell the truth. Ethan noticed the tension returning to her shoulders. You look nervous. There are cameras everywhere. You survived worse things than cameras. Clara smiled faintly. That is what you said last time. And I was right last time. She looked up at him then. God, he still had that effect on her. Not because he was powerful. Not because he could open doors with one phone call. Because when Ethan looked at her, he did not look like a man admiring something fragile. He looked like a man standing beside someone he respected. That was what had changed everything. Not the jacket. Not the car. Not the surgeon's card. Respect. Consistency. The fact that he stayed even when staying became inconvenient. Clara swallowed softly. I never thank you properly. Ethan frowned a little. For what? For listening when I said I did not want to be saved like a debt. Something emotional flickered across his face. Clara continued, voice quieter now. You could have made everything about money. You did not. You helped me find choices. There is a difference. Ethan looked down for a moment, as if the words reached a place in him no boardroom ever had. You taught me the difference. Clara blinked. I spent years thinking power meant being able to fix things quickly, he said. Then I met you, and I realized sometimes real help means slowing down enough to ask what someone actually needs. Her eyes filled, but she smiled through it. That sounds suspiciously healthy. I am told growth is uncomfortable. She laughed, and Ethan smiled at the sound like it still surprised him every time. A staff member knocked gently. Ms. Whitmore? They are ready for you. Clara's breath caught. Ethan held out his hand. Ready? She looked at his hand, then at the door, then at her own reflection in the mirror. For years, she had believed survival meant carrying everything alone. Tonight, she understood something different. Strength was not refusing every hand offered. Strength was knowing which hands did not try to own you when they helped you stand. Clara placed her hand in Ethan's. No, she said honestly. But I am going anyway. Ethan's smile softened. That is usually what courage looks like. Together they walked toward the ballroom entrance. When Clara stepped onto the stage, the light hit her so brightly that for a second she could not see the audience. She felt Ethan stop just behind the curtain, close enough to be there, far enough to let the moment belong to her. Ivy sat in the front row beside Dr. Harper. Smiling through tears, she was pretending not to wipe away. Clara reached the microphone. Her hands trembled once, then steadied. My name is Clara Whitmore, she began, her voice soft but clear. For a long time, I thought needing help meant I had failed. The ballroom quieted. I thought strong people were the ones who never asked, never rested, never became inconvenient. But hospital corridors teach you the truth. Love makes all of us inconvenient sometimes. Illness interrupts work. Fear interrupts sleep. Bills interrupt dignity. And too many good people are forced to apologize for needing what should have been available all along. Clara looked at Ivy, then at the crowd. This fund is not about charity that makes rich people feel generous for one evening. It is about responsibility. It is about making sure a sister does not have to choose between rent and medicine. It is about making sure a mother can take a bus to a specialist without losing her job. It is about remembering that people are not less valuable because their lives are harder to manage. Her voice shook slightly on the last sentence, but she did not apologize for it. She saw Ethan behind the curtain, his eyes bright with something he would probably deny later. She saw Mia near the side entrance, grinning proudly. She saw Ivy press one hand over her heart. Clara took one final breath. I used to think fate changed your life in one dramatic moment, she said. But I was wrong. Sometimes fate is quieter than that. Sometimes it is someone turning away when respect matters. Someone staying when leaving would be easier. Someone reminding you that compassion is not weakness. And sometimes, it is the moment you finally believe you do not have to become hard just because the world has been. The silence that followed lasted one heartbeat. Then the ballroom rose. Applause thundered beneath the chandeliers, but Clara barely heard it. She was looking at Ivy, who was crying openly now, laughing at herself while clapping harder than anyone else. Clara laughed too, tears slipping down her face without shame. Backstage afterward, Ethan met her in the quiet corridor where it had all begun months earlier. You were extraordinary, he said. Clara wiped one tear with the back of her hand. I was shaking. Yes, he said gently. And you spoke anyway. For a moment, neither moved. The music from the ballroom drifted softly through the wall. Sydney Harbor shimmered beyond the windows in spring light. The world had not become perfect. Ivy would still have follow-up appointments. Clara would still have difficult days. Ethan would still have to unlearn years of hiding behind control. But something important had changed. Clara no longer felt grateful just because someone had noticed her pain. She felt proud because she had turned that pain into something useful. Ethan reached for her hand, careful as always, never assuming. Clara met him halfway. As long as I do not have to do it alone, she whispered. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. You will not. Clara smiled, but this time the promise did not feel like rescue. It felt like partnership. And somewhere beyond the ballroom windows, Sydney Harbor glittered beneath the afternoon sun, while two people from different worlds finally understood the lesson fate had been trying to teach them from the beginning. Love is not someone powerful saving someone weak. Love is two wounded people choosing to become kinder, braver, and more human together.